Good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Carolyn Harris, and I am the Records and Information Manager and Privacy Officer at Kwanlin Dün First Nation in Whitehorse, Yukon. I'm really pleased to join the folks at Western Information Management today for the first session of their new initiative, Learn With Us. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the traditional territories of the Kwanlin Dün First Nation and the Ta'an Council, two of Yukon's 11 self-governing First Nations. I'm fortunate to live, work, and travel on these traditional territories and to work for the Kwanlin Dün government. A bit of background about me. I'm originally from Southern Ontario, but I've lived in the Yukon for almost a decade now. I have a Master of Information Studies from the University of Toronto, where I was in the archives concentration. I have worked as an information management professional for 14 years, the last 8 of which has been in records and information management. I've worked at Kwanlin Dün First Nation for over 6 years now, leading the development of a RIM program pretty much from the ground up. I'm looking forward to sharing my experiences with Shared Drive Cleanup with you today, with the caveat that it has been somewhat of a checkered history of successes and not so successes, but hopefully the information will still be valuable to you. So I'll start very briefly with a bit of information about Kwanlin Dün First Nation, where I work. First, some geography to situate you. So Kwanlin Dün First Nation, or KDFN, is a self-governing First Nation in the Yukon, whose traditional territory is in and around the capital of Whitehorse in the south of the territory. KDFN is the largest of the 14 First Nations in the Yukon with over 1,000 citizens. The First Nation signed its final agreement and became self-governing in 2005 after 35 years of Yukon Indigenous people negotiating their land claim settlements. KDFN is one of the first, or one of the few, urban First Nations in Canada. It's actually the largest landowner in Whitehorse. And the government is made up of 5 branches. There is the council, which is made up of an elected chief and 6 councillors who serve 3-year terms. There's also the Elders Council, Judicial Council, Youth Council, and General Assembly. And the nation employs about 200 staff full-time in 8 departments, which are listed on the slide there. So now I'd like to just jump right into today's topic of Shared Drive Cleanup. And I'll start at a high level of where Shared Drive Cleanup fits in the evolution or the development of a RIM program. So in terms of dependencies before undertaking Shared Drive Cleanup, you will need to have certain tools and resources in place. First, a records classification system, and ideally a retention schedule as well. It's certainly possible to do Shared Drive Cleanup without having a classification scheme, but from the perspective of RIM, the two go hand in hand, since retention is tied to your classification, and ideally, you want to organize your shared drive to facilitate lifecycle management. Second, you will need solid IT infrastructure in place. And obviously, if you're contemplating a shared drive cleanup, you already have shared network drives, but it'll also be helpful if you have some kind of tool, a software tool for identifying duplicates. And so this fits into the ROT, or what we call the redundant, the obsolete, the trivial or temporary files that you have on your network. So you can clean all that rot that you don't need off the top. Other useful tools is a tool that would scan for long file paths, because file paths have a limit and you run into problems when they're too long. You'll need to have planned a new security framework for the newly organized drives. So your folder permissions, your access permissions, when you get that new structure built out. And you might want to approach it where you're moving and reorganizing a copy of the files in a different location rather than the active files themselves that staff are using and accessing every day. Of course, if you're doing this on the network, then you're going to need adequate server space to do it and IT's cooperation. If you have a software application for Shared Drive Cleanup, then this kind of test environment is built in, because you're able to map the files virtually to their new locations before they're ever actually moved on the server. Another essential consideration is staffing. Obviously, you need to have the human resources to undertake the project. So my first project at Kwanlin Dün, it was just me, and it took a year and a half. While my second project, which did incorporate a software tool and also was worked on by 3 staff, was done in 3 months. So quite a difference there. One helpful, though not essential thing to have in place is policies and procedures, particularly around shared drive governance. So, and you will at least need a plan and procedures for how the drive will be cleaned up and how it will be maintained after the project. So how are you going to keep the governance of that structure in place and ensure that the chaos just doesn't grow back again over time? Shared drive cleanup is definitely a major project in a RIM program. It's part of implementing a RIM program when you're implementing a new classification scheme or retention schedule. And then it can also lay the groundwork for EDRMS implementation down the road, if that is part of your plan. So today I'm going to tell you the highlights and the lowlights of my 3 Valiant attempts at shared drive cleanup undertaken from the trenches of RIM practice. These are 3 different projects that I've undertaken and overseen at KDFN since 2016. The first project is or was a shared drive cleanup in our Heritage Lands and Resources Department. It was done entirely manually with no software to assist. This was one of the first projects that I undertook when I came to Kwanlin Dün. The first stage was developing a classification system for the department, and then that was to be implemented with the electronic records via a shared drive cleanup. So I started off the project with quite a vision. It was my first shared drive cleanup. I was rather a baby records manager at the time. So, I did my research. I talked to people in my network. I had a perfect plan for how it was going to go. I don't know if anyone can relate to this, but what they say about the best laid plans. But my plan was that at the beginning of the project, the ROT, the redundant, obsolete, trivial files would be eliminated. The new Active Directory with a new folder structure would be set up for the department's records. The permission was going to be read-only at the top 2 levels, the primary and secondary levels of the classification, to try and put in place some of that governance so that the files would not proliferate, particularly at the upper levels. And so staff would be briefed on the project. There'd be a training session on the structure, and then they'd be given 2 months to move their files into the new drive. And after 2 months, they'd be told that the original drive was going to disappear. And it wouldn't really disappear, but it would be hidden, or they would be it would disappear for them. And that would give them the motivation to move their files in within those 2 months. So then there'd be a 6-month test period for the new structure where record staff would work with the department staff to fine tune and tweak the structure, make sure it was working for them. After 6 months, anything that was not moved from the old location would be deleted again, or maybe just made read-only. And then finally, after another 6 months, there'd be a postmortem with RIM to get feedback on how it had all gone. So that was the vision. Of course, the reality of how the project went was quite different. First off, the department director wanted the staff to have the support of records management staff during the project. So rather than training staff and letting them go and move the files themselves, it was one-on-one meetings with staff or with units to manually move the files. So I held 2-hour meetings with different units 2 to 3 times a week. And it really turned into a pretty painstaking manual process. The staff lacked familiarity with many records, like the older records especially. So we ended up opening folders at the lower levels, even opening documents to see what was in there and investigate. And it just ended up being a very granular level of classification and migration, much more than I had anticipated. In terms of timing and project management, this was only one of several major projects that I was undertaking at the time. So the timeline really stretched out. I had 37 hours of meetings with 6 units, but that stretched over 18 months. So it really was quite an extended timeline for one department. And there was one unit that I didn't get to at all. the Fish and Wildlife unit because the director was acting director. They were his files. And basically as acting director, he never had time to sit down with me and go through all the Fish and Wildlife records. They also happened to be scattered in his email, in his personal drive, even at home. So, you know, not a good situation. But all in all, I guess the conclusion to that, or the result of that, was that there was really no clear conclusion to the project. It kind of just trailed off and ended. And I didn't provide the aftercare that I should have, looking back, to make sure, to formally end the project, to make sure that what had been created was going to be maintained. And then in the next couple of years in the department, there was quite a lot of turnover. And it turned out that the new staff couldn't really find anything. The filing structure didn't mean anything to them, even though the staff at the time had been closely involved in creating the classification. It really didn't mean anything. It was not intuitive for new staff, which was unfortunate. So lessons learned from this first project is the importance of striking a balance between staff involvement and RIM staff doing the file organization themselves. So how much you're going to involve the staff in migrating the files. Staff are the subject matter experts and you'll always need them. But you want to try and keep the exercise from becoming a walk down memory lane where you're opening files and, oh, I remember this project, let me tell you about what happened. And as interesting as it can be to learn that history about your organization, it can get off track for sure. And it just adds to the timeline. So you want to try and work at as high a folder level as possible without drilling down to the granular level. And the ultimate lesson really was that manual migration is painful and time consuming. At the rate I was going, it was going to take me 9 years to get through all of the departments at KDFN, both creating a classification with the staff and then doing the shared drive cleanup. So the conclusion that I reached was that we really needed a tool to help with shared drive cleanup, and also that we should establish a government-wide classification. So that is what we did in 2018 with consultants. We did establish a records classification and retention schedule, or an RCRS, for all departments. And then we were well set up for the second project in 2019. So the second project was software assisted. It was a shared drive cleanup in the Executive Council office, sort of a pilot project of the RCRS implementation in Kwanlin Dün's smallest department, where there are 6 units, or actually 6 staff pretty much, with the addition of 3 record staff, also part of the department. So it was our own department that we piloted in. And again, the vision for this project, there was to be a kickoff meeting that would include training staff on the RCRS, then initial meetings held with each unit to kind of get the lay of the land and understand what volume and what records we were dealing with. Then we would map the files to the new locations, meeting one-on-one with staff using the mapping or the cleanup software. I estimated that this was going to take about 45 work hours. Another important step would be determining the security matrix for the new structure. And then once everything was mapped and ready, we would carry out the migration via the software. It would happen at the end. We would review the records that are classified as permanent in our retention schedule, either before or after, right after the migration. And then I planned a 3-month postmortem audit and review with staff to identify what had gone well and not, and get that feedback. So in reality, the kickoff meeting went well. I got positive feedback on that and the training. We held 1-hour meetings with each staff member to assess the locations, the volume, the organization of their records in all formats. And then we would sit one-on-one with the software, reorganizing people's files. And this took anywhere from half an hour to 23 hours with each staff member, with a total of 40 hours spent over 2 months. And then in addition, the RIM staff worked on the records of past staff who were no longer with the organization. That was an additional 20 hours. So the total was 60 hours of one-on-one time spent with staff, or mapping time. In the end, the project had a pretty sad end because everything was mapped. It was ready to go after about 3 months of work. And when we pushed the go button and we were ready to do the migration, it didn't work. And we couldn't get it to work. Basically, the software could not connect to our network properly for security reasons. We worked on it for several months, and eventually 9 months later, we just gave up and realized that we weren't going to be able to use the software. And unfortunately, all the work that was captured in it, all that mapping, was basically lost. So certainly lessons to be learned with that project. Of course, senior management support is essential. You have to realize that you will be using staff time. Presumably, you will use staff time on a regular basis. They are, again, they're the subject matter experts and you can't do without them. So it's important to gain staff buy-in. Have that positive kickoff meeting. Keep your communication levels high, motivate staff. People, will have games or contests or like Friday afternoon pizza parties. I have heard success stories about, meeting on a Friday afternoon and having your pizza and your little filing party and, within a month or 4 Fridays or whatever, having your department's files all organized. So a lot depends, I think, on your organization, but that motivation and that buy-in from staff is definitely something desirable. It also became apparent that the records knowledge that you gain that I gained as a RIM practitioner really turned me into an incomparable resource. The knowledge of the context of the records and how, being able to classify everything came in handy later and continues to be, because now I'm actually the last person left in the department from that period. And so for anything historical, when anyone wants to find something or understand something, I'm the go-to now, because I know that history and I know where the records are. Another lesson is certainly that having a software tool, a mapping and automated tool is ideal. Something virtual that keeps the active files that staff are still using untouched until go time. And then finally, definitely test your software early on. Play with it, make sure it works, make sure it's doing what you need it to do. That was certainly probably my biggest mistake with that project, is putting all that work in and then having it not work, despite, everyone on the team, IT and their support, the vendor support, thinking that we were fine. So the third project then, which was just last year and over the winter, we outsourced shared drive cleanup of the same department. So at the time, we had limited staff capacity in records management. It was actually only myself on the records team at the time, and I was also transitioning into a secondment role. And so I had decreasing time to devote to records in general and the project. But we also had a high desire to try again and to get this cleanup finally done for this department that was started 2 years ago. So I carried forward from the previous project still significant knowledge of the records context and the classification and where everything would fit. And then the consultants were the software vendor. Full disclosure, we were working with Western Information Management. We were using their Whisper tool. So they had the expertise with the software, and they also had expertise with our records classification and retention schedule, because they were the consultants we worked with when we established that. And so they brought that ready knowledge to the table to enable the mapping to be pretty efficient. And also, of course, they brought the human resources to do the dirty work, to dig in and do a lot of the moving. The target that we were aiming for was to have at least 80% of the existing folders and files moved to new locations or migrated into the new structure. And then we asked that the contractor provide a crosswalk reference from the old to the new file locations as a helpful finding aid and a support to staff. And this project was planned to be a 3-month project with ongoing support to follow after that if needed. So then we look at the reality and how it turned out. Certainly the contractor handled the lion's share of hands-on work, setting up the new folder structure, mapping the files. They really took that load off of me as the only record staff and somebody who couldn't dive in as deeply as I wanted to. My expertise was certainly still needed to understand the nature, the background, in order to classify a lot of the records. Ultimately, really, the demands on my time limited the progress of the project, and so I put that on us, on KDFN, and at our end for sure. After 5 months, a fair amount of mapping was done, but few records were actually migrated. And in the department, staff had been using a temporary folder for the duration of the project while the new structure was built out on the shared drive. Because all of those staff were pretty new, they had been at KDFN a year or less. It was pretty fine for them. It worked fine just to have a temporary location where they were creating new records. And then at the end, after the project concluded, I provided them with training on the RCRS and the new structure and got them going, moving their files from the temporary folder into the new built out structure on the shared drive. And that went pretty well. So lessons learned, part 3. Outsourcing worked well because the contractor knew the RCRS very well. So that was a learning curve that wasn't really there for them. I mean, it was leveled out, which was a positive. The project management responsibilities were handled by the contractor, and so that took a load off of myself as records manager. Was certainly what we had been looking for with the outsourcing. But on the other hand, it also limited the efficacy of the project. That didn't have my full attention and that I couldn't spend as much time on as I would have liked because of my other role. There were definitely pros and cons to me learning the software throughout the project, but I still wasn't really using it frequently. So how much of that I've retained remains to be seen. It could definitely, in other circumstances, have been more of an opportunity to build internal capacity, because had I had a team at the time, they could have learned the software much more thoroughly as well at the time, and we could have taken the opportunity to make it a learning experience. And again, I mean, I keep coming back to subject matter expertise. It is essential, and particularly with outsourcing, because consultants are not going to know your records, your functions, and documentation as well as you can or your staff can. I had retained that knowledge from the first attempt with the department. So with this outsourced project, we didn't need to involve department staff at all. So finally, just to wrap up with the overall lessons learned, really consider your organization's culture, your staff attitudes, how much senior management support you have, how much time you have to devote to the project. I think a lot depends on the culture, the motivations of your staff, their compliance, as to how efficiently you can get this done, how much or how little staff should be involved versus RIM staff doing it themselves. You will have better and faster success if you use a software tool, and make sure that you test it, you play around with it, consider its usability, and definitely involve your IT team in acquiring it and implementing and using it. Outsourcing can certainly decrease the burden on internal resources, although nothing beats subject matter expertise at the end of the day. And don't forget about aftercare and maintenance. So governance of the new drive, training of new staff ongoing as they come on, continuing with communication, doing audits, making sure that mess doesn't just grow back and that you're able to maintain that new, clean, tidy, and organized shared drive. So I hope it's been helpful hearing about all these ups and downs as I've experienced them with shared drive cleanups and the lessons I've learned along the way. I'm looking forward to the discussion and answering any questions that you have. Ganashish, Shanithan, Masicho, and thank you for your attention.